There's one name that has always been synonymous with the word detective, and that is none other than Sherlock Holmes. Holmes, though a very complicated fellow, is the quintessential good guy who always manages to catch the villain, no matter how cunning and tricky they may be. So let's follow the clues and begin unravelling the mysteries behind Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes is a fictional private detective created by British author Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Referring to himself as a consulting detective in the stories, Holmes is known for his proficiency with observation, forensic science, and logical reasoning that borders on the fantastic, which he employs when investigating cases for a wide variety of clients, including Scotland Yard. First appearing in print in 1887's A Study in Scarlet, the character's popularity became widespread with the first series of short stories in the Strand magazine, beginning with A Scandal in Bohemia in 1891. Additional tales appeared from then until 1927, eventually totaling 4 novels and 56 short stories. All but one are set in the Victorian or Edwardian eras, between about 1880 and 1914. Most are narrated by the character of Holmes's friend and biographer, Dr. Watson, who usually accompanies Holmes during his investigations and often shares quarters with him at the address of 221B Baker Street, London, where many of the stories begin. Though not the first fictional detective, Sherlock Holmes is arguably the best known, with Guinness World Records listing him as the most portrayed movie character in history. Holmes's popularity and fame are such that many have believed him to be not a fictional character but a real individual. Numerous literary and fan societies have been founded that pretend to operate on this principle. Widely considered a British cultural icon, the character and stories have had a profound and lasting effect on mystery writing and popular culture as a whole, with the original tales, as well as thousands written by authors other than Conan Doyle, being adapted into stage and radio plays, television, films, video games, and other media for over 100 years. Edgar Allan Poe's C. Auguste Dupin is generally acknowledged as the first detective in fiction and served as the prototype for many later characters, including Holmes. Conan Doyle once wrote, "Each of Poe's detective stories is a root from which a whole literature has developed." Where was the detective story until Poe breathed the breath of life into it? Similarly, the stories of Émile Gaboriau's Monsieur Lecoq were extremely popular at the time Conan Doyle began writing Holmes, and Holmes's speech and behaviour sometimes follows that of Lecoq. Holmes and Watson discuss Dupin and Lecoq at the beginning of A Study in Scarlet. Conan Doyle repeatedly said that Holmes was inspired by the real-life figure of Joseph Bell, a surgeon at the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh, whom Conan Doyle met in 1887 and had worked for as a clerk. Like Holmes, Bell was noted for drawing broad conclusions from minute observations. However, he later wrote to Conan Doyle, "You are yourself, Sherlock Holmes, and well you know it." Sir Henry Littlejohn, Chair of Medical Jurisprudence at the University of Edinburgh Medical School, is also cited as an inspiration for Holmes. Littlejohn, who was also police surgeon and medical officer of health in Edinburgh, provided Conan Doyle with a link between medical investigation and the detection of crime. Other inspirations have been proposed, such as Maximilien Heller by French author Henry Cauvin. In this 1871 novel, 16 years before the first appearance of Sherlock Holmes, Henry Cauvin imagined a depressed, antisocial, opium-smoking polymath detective operating in Paris. It is not known if Conan Doyle read the novel, but he was fluent in French. Michael Harrison has suggested that a German self-styled consulting detective named Walter Scherer may have been the model for Holmes. Details about Sherlock Holmes's life are scarce in Conan Doyle's stories. Nevertheless, mentions of his early life and extended family paint a loose biographical picture of the detective. An estimate of Holmes's age in His Last Bow places his year of birth at 1854. The story, set in August 1914, describes him as 60 years of age. His parents are not mentioned in the stories, although Holmes mentions that his ancestors were country squires. In The Adventure of the Greek Interpreter, he claims that his grandmother was sister to the French artist Vernet, without clarifying whether this was Claude, Joseph, Carl, or Horace Vernet. Holmes's brother Mycroft, 7 years his senior, is a government official. Mycroft has a unique civil service position as a kind of human database for all aspects of government policy. He lacks Sherlock's interest in physical investigation, however, preferring to spend his time at the Diogenes Club. Holmes says that he first developed his methods of deduction as an undergraduate. His earliest cases, which he pursued as an amateur, came from fellow university students. A meeting with a classmate's father led him to adopt detection as a profession, and he spent several years after university as a consultant before financial difficulties led him to accept John H. Watson as a fellow lodger. The two take lodgings at 221B Baker Street, London, an apartment at the upper north end of the street, up 17 steps. Holmes worked as a detective for 23 years, with physician John Watson assisting him for 17. They were roommates before Watson's 1888 marriage, and again after his wife's death. Their residence is maintained by their landlady, Mrs. Hudson. Most of the stories are frame narratives, written from Watson's point of view as summaries of the detective's most interesting cases. Holmes frequently calls Watson's writing sensational and populist, suggesting that it fails to accurately and objectively report the science of his craft. Sherlock Holmes says of John Watson's pamphlet in The Sign of the Four, "Detection is, or ought to be, an exact science, and should be treated in the same cold and unemotional manner. You have attempted to tinge it with romanticism, which produces much the same effect as if you worked on a love story into the fifth proposition of Euclid. Some facts should be suppressed, or at least, a just sense of proportion should be observed in treating them. The only point in the case which deserved mention was the curious analytical reasoning from effects to causes by which I succeeded in unravelling it." Nevertheless, Holmes's relationship with Watson is his most significant relationship. When Watson is injured by a bullet, although the wounds turn out to be quite superficial, Watson is moved by Holmes's reaction. It was worth a wound. It was worth many wounds, to know the depth of loyalty and love which lay behind that cold mask. The clear, hard eyes were dimmed for a moment, and the firm lips were shaking. For the one and only time, I caught a glimpse of a great heart as well as of a great brain. All my years of humble but single-minded service culminated in that moment of revelation. Holmes's clients vary from the most powerful monarchs and governments of Europe, to wealthy aristocrats and industrialists, to impoverished pawnbrokers and governesses. He is known only in select professional circles at the beginning of the first story, but is already collaborating with Scotland Yard. However, his continued work and the publication of Watson's stories raises Holmes's profile, and he rapidly becomes well known as a detective. So many clients ask for his help instead of, or in addition to, that of the police that, Watson writes, by 1895, Holmes has an immense practice. Police outside London ask Holmes for assistance if he is nearby, even during a vacation. A Prime Minister and the King of Bohemia visit 221B Baker Street in person to request Holmes's assistance. The government of France awards him its Legion of Honor for solving a case. The King of Scandinavia is a client, and he aids the Vatican at least twice. The detective acts on behalf of the British government in matters of national security several times, and declines a knighthood for services which may perhaps someday be described. The first set of Holmes's stories was published between 1887 and 1893. Wishing to devote more time to his historical novels, Conan Doyle killed off Holmes in a final battle with the criminal mastermind Professor James Moriarty in The Final Problem, published in 1893 but set in 1891. Legend has it that Londoners were so distraught upon hearing the news of Holmes's death that they wore black armbands in mourning. However, there is no known contemporary source for this. The earliest known reference to such events comes in 1949. After resisting public pressure for 8 years, Conan Doyle wrote The Hound of the Baskervilles, which was serialized in 1901 to 1902, with an implicit setting before Holmes's death. In 1903, Conan Doyle wrote The Adventure of the Empty House, set in 1894. Holmes reappears, explaining to a stunned Watson that he had faked his death to fool his enemies. The Adventure of the Empty House marks the beginning of the second set of stories which Conan Doyle wrote in 1927. Holmes aficionados refer to the period from 1891 to 1894, that is, between his disappearance and presumed death in The Final Problem and his reappearance in The Adventure of the Empty House, as the Great Hiatus. The earliest known use of this expression is in the article Sherlock Holmes and the Great Hiatus by Edgar W. Smith, published in the July 1946 issue of the Baker Street Journal. In his last bow, Holmes has retired to a small farm on the Sussex Downs and taken up beekeeping as his primary occupation. The move is not dated precisely, but can be presumed to be no later than 1904, since it is referred to retrospectively in the second Stain, first published that year. The story features Holmes and Watson coming out of retirement to aid the war effort. Only one other adventure, The Adventure of the Lion's Mane, takes place during the detective's retirement. Watson describes Holmes as bohemian in his habits and lifestyle. Described by Watson in The Hound of the Baskervilles as having a cat-like love of personal cleanliness, Holmes is an eccentric with no regard for contemporary standards of tidiness or good order. In many of the stories, Holmes dives into an apparent mess to find a relevant item. In The Adventure of the Musgrave Ritual, Watson says, although in his methods of thought he was the neatest and most methodical of mankind, he keeps his cigars in the coal scuttle, his tobacco in the toe end of a Persian slipper, and his unanswered correspondence transfixed by a jackknife into the very centre of his wooden mantelpiece. He had a horror of destroying documents. Thus, month after month, his papers accumulated, until every corner of the room was stacked with bundles of manuscript which were on no account to be burned, and which could not be put away save by their owner. The detective starves himself at times of intense intellectual activity, such as during The Adventure of the Norwood Builder, wherein, according to Watson, Holmes had no breakfast for himself, for it was one of his peculiarities that in his more intense moments he would permit himself no food, and I have known him to presume upon his iron strength until he fainted from pure inanition. While the detective is usually dispassionate and cold, during an investigation he is animated and excitable. He has a flair for showmanship, preparing elaborate traps to capture and expose a culprit, often to impress observers. His companion condones the detective's willingness to bend the truth or break the law on behalf of a client, lying to the police, concealing evidence or breaking into houses when he feels it morally justifiable, but condemns Holmes's manipulation of innocent people in The Adventure of Charles Augustus Milverton. Holmes derives pleasure from baffling police inspectors with his deductions and has supreme confidence, bordering on arrogance, in his intellectual abilities. While the detective does not actually seek fame and is usually content to let the police take public credit for his work, he is pleased when his skills are recognized and responds to flattery. Except for that of Watson, Holmes avoids casual company. In The Adventure of the Glorious Scot, he tells the doctor that during 2 years at college, he made only one friend. "I was never a very sociable fellow, Watson. I never mixed much with the men of my year." The detective is similarly described in A Study in Scarlet. As shooting practice during a period of boredom, Holmes decorates the wall of his Baker Street lodgings with a patriotic Victoria Regina in bullet pocks from his revolver. Holmes relaxes with music in the Red-Headed League, taking the evening off from a case to listen to Pablo de Saraste play violin. His enjoyment of vocal music, particularly Wagner, is evident in The Adventure of the Red Circle. Holmes occasionally uses addictive drugs, especially in the absence of stimulating cases. He uses cocaine, which he injects in a 7% solution with a syringe kept in a Morocco leather case. Although Holmes also dabbles in morphine, he expresses strong disapproval when he visits an opium den. Both drugs were legal in 19th century England. As a physician, Watson strongly disapproves of his friend's cocaine habit, describing it as the detective's only vice, and concerned about its effect on Holmes's mental health and intellect. In The Adventure of the Missing Three-Quarter, Watson says that although he has weaned Holmes from drugs, the detective remains an addict whose habit is not dead but merely sleeping. Watson and Holmes both use tobacco, smoking cigarettes, cigars, and pipes. Although his chronicler does not consider Holmes's smoking a vice per se, Watson, a physician, occasionally criticizes the detective for creating a poisonous atmosphere in their confined quarters. The detective is known to charge clients for his expenses and claim any reward offered for a problem's solution, such as in The Adventure of the Speckled Band, The Red-Headed League, and The Adventure of the Beryl Coronet. In The Problem of Tor Bridge, the detective says, "My professional charges are upon a fixed scale. I do not vary them, save when I remit them altogether." In this context, a client is offering to double his fee, and it is implied that wealthy clients habitually pay Holmes more than his standard rate. In The Adventure of the Priory School, Holmes earns a £6,000 fee, an amount that surprises even Watson, at a time where annual expenses for a rising young professional were in the area of £500. However, in The Adventure of Black Peter, Watson notes that Holmes would refuse to help even the wealthy and powerful if their cases did not interest him. Although when the stories begin, Holmes needed Watson to share the rent for their residence, by the time of the final problem, he says that his services to the government of France and the royal family of Scandinavia had left him with enough money to retire comfortably. As Conan Doyle wrote to Joseph Bell, Holmes is as inhuman as a Babbage's calculating machine and just about as likely to fall in love. Holmes says in The Valley of Fear, "I am not a whole-souled admirer of womankind," and in The Adventure of the Second Stain, finds the motives of women inscrutable. How could you build on such quicksand? Their most trivial actions may mean volumes. Their most extraordinary conduct may depend upon a hairpin or a curling tong. In The Sign of the Four, he says, "I would not tell them too much. Women are never to be entirely trusted, not the best of them." Watson says in The Adventure of the Copper Beeches that the detective inevitably manifested no further interest in the client when once she had ceased to be the center of one of his problems. In The Lion's Mane, Holmes writes, "Women have seldom been an attraction to me, for my brain has always governed my heart," indicating that he has been attracted to women in some way on occasion, but has not been interested in pursuing relationships with them. Ultimately, however, in The Adventure of the Devil's Foot, he claims outright that "I have never loved." At the end of The Sign of Four, Holmes states that "love is an emotional thing, and whatever is emotional is opposed to that true cold reason which I place above all things. I shall never marry myself lest I bias my judgment." Despite his overall attitude, Holmes is adept at effortlessly putting his clients at ease, and Watson says that although the detective has an aversion to women, he has a peculiarly ingratiating way with them. Watson notes in The Adventure of the Dying Detective that Mrs. Hudson is fond of Holmes because of his remarkable gentleness and courtesy in his dealings with women. He disliked and distrusted the sex, but he was always a chivalrous opponent. In The Adventure of Charles Augustus Milverton, the detective easily manages to become engaged under false pretenses in order to obtain information about a case, but also abandons the woman once he has the information he requires. Though the stories always refer to Holmes's intellectual detection method as deduction, he primarily relies on abduction, inferring an explanation for observed details. From a drop of water, he writes, a logician could infer the possibility of an Atlantic or a Niagara without having seen or heard of one or the other. In A Scandal in Bohemia, Holmes infers that Watson had got wet lately and had a most clumsy and careless servant girl. When Watson asks how Holmes knows this, the detective answers, "It is simplicity itself. My eyes tell me that on the inside of your left shoe, just where the firelight strikes it, the leather is scored by 6 almost parallel cuts. Obviously they have been caused by someone who has very carelessly scraped round the edges of the sole in order to remove crusted mud from it. Hence, you see, my double deduction that you had been out in vile weather and that you had a particularly malignant boot-slitting specimen of the London slavey." In the first Holmes story, A Study in Scarlet, Dr. Watson compares Holmes to C. Auguste Dupin, Edgar Allan Poe's fictional detective who employed a similar methodology. Alluding to an episode in The Murders in the Rue Morgue, where Dupin determines what his friend is thinking, despite their having walked together in silence for a quarter of an hour, Holmes remarks, "That trick of his breaking in on his friend's thoughts with an apropos remark is really very showy and superficial." Nevertheless, Holmes later performs the same trick on Watson in The Adventure of the Cardboard Box, and again in The Adventure of the Dancing Men. This methodology allows Holmes to learn a stranger's occupation and other details. He observes the dress and attitude of his clients and suspects, noting skin marks such as tattoos, contamination such as ink stains or clay on boots, emotional state, and physical condition in order to deduce their origins and recent history. The style and state of wear of a person's clothes and personal items are also commonly relied on. In the stories, Holmes is seen applying his method to walking sticks, pipes, hats, and other objects. Holmes does employ deductive reasoning as well. The detective's guiding principle, as he says in The Sign of the Four and other stories, is when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Despite Holmes's remarkable reasoning abilities, Conan Doyle still paints him as fallible in this regard, this being a central theme of The Adventure of the Yellow Face. Though Holmes is famed for his reasoning capabilities, his investigative technique relies heavily on the acquisition of hard evidence. Many of the techniques he employs in the stories were at the time in their infancy. For example, Scotland Yard's Fingerprint Bureau opened in 1901. The detective is particularly skilled in the analysis of trace evidence and other physical evidence, including latent prints, such as footprints, hoof prints, and shoe and tire impressions to identify actions at a crime scene, using tobacco ashes and cigarette butts to identify criminals, handwriting analysis and graphology, comparing typewritten letters to expose a fraud, using gunpowder residue to expose 2 murderers, comparing bullets from 2 crime scenes, analysing small pieces of human remains to expose 2 murders, and an early use of fingerprints. Because of the small scale of much of his evidence, the detective often uses a magnifying glass at the scene and an optical microscope at his Baker Street lodgings. He uses analytical chemistry for blood residue analysis and toxicology to detect poisons. Holmes's home chemistry laboratory is mentioned in The Adventure of the Naval Treaty. Ballistics feature in The Adventure of the Empty House, when spent bullets are recovered and matched with a suspected murder weapon. Holmes displays a strong aptitude for acting and disguise. In several stories, to gather evidence under cover, he uses disguises so convincing that Watson fails to recognize him. In others, Holmes feigns injury or illness to incriminate the guilty. Until Watson's arrival at Baker Street, Holmes largely worked alone, only occasionally employing agents from the city's underclass. These agents included a variety of informants, such as Langdale Pike, a human book of reference upon all matters of social scandal, and Shinwell Johnson, who acted as Holmes's agent in the huge criminal underworld of London. The most well-known of Holmes's agents are a group of street children he called the Baker Street Irregulars. Holmes and Watson often carry pistols with them, in Watson's case his old service weapon. Holmes and Watson shoot the eponymous hound in The Hound of the Baskervilles, and in The Adventures of the Empty House, Holmes pistol whips Colonel Sebastian Moran. In The Adventure of the Solitary Cyclist, The Adventure of Black Peter, and The Adventure of the Dancing Men, Holmes or Watson use a pistol to capture the criminals. As a gentleman, Holmes often carries a stick or cane. He is described by Watson as an expert at single stick and uses his cane twice as a weapon. In A Study in Scarlet, Watson describes Holmes as an expert swordsman, and in The Adventure of the Gloria Scott, the detective practices fencing. In several stories, Holmes wields a riding crop, described in the latter story as his favourite weapon. The detective is described as possessing above-average physical strength. In The Yellow Face, Holmes's chronicler says, "Few men were capable of greater muscular effort." In The Adventure of the Speckled Band, Dr. Roylott demonstrates his strength by bending a fire poker in half. Watson describes Holmes as laughing. "If he had remained, I might have shown him that my grip was not much more feeble than his own." As he spoke, he picked up the steel poker and, with a sudden effort, straightened it out again. Holmes is an adept bare-knuckle fighter. The Adventure of the Gloria Scott mentions that Holmes trained as a boxer. In The Sign of the Four, he introduces himself to McMurdo, a prize fighter, as the amateur who fought 3 rounds with you at Alison's rooms on the night of your benefit 4 years back. McMurdo remembers, "Ah, you're one that has wasted your gifts, you have. You might have aimed high if you had joined the fancy." In The Yellow Face, Watson says, "He was undoubtedly one of the finest boxers of his weight that I have ever seen." The detective occasionally engages in hand-to-hand combat with his adversaries, in The Adventure of the Solitary Cyclist and The Adventure of the Naval Treaty. In The Adventure of the Empty House, Holmes tells Watson that he used a Japanese martial art known as Baritsu to fling Moriarty to his death in the Reichenbach Falls. Baritsu is Conan Doyle's version of Bartitsu, which combines jiu-jitsu with boxing and cane fencing. Although Holmes is not the original fictional detective, his name has become synonymous with the role. The investigating detective, such as Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot and Dorothy L. Sayers' Lord Peter Wimsey, became a successful character for a number of authors. The phrase, "elementary, my dear Watson," has become one of the most quoted and iconic aspects of the character. However, although Holmes often observes that his conclusions are elementary, and occasionally calls Watson "my dear Watson," the phrase "elementary, my dear Watson" is never uttered by him in any of the 60 stories by Conan Doyle. One of the nearest approximations of the phrase appears in The Adventure of the Crooked Man, when Holmes explains a deduction. "Excellent," I cried. "Elementary," said he. William Gillette is widely considered to have originated the phrase with the formulation, "Oh, this is elementary, my dear fellow," allegedly in his 1899 play Sherlock Holmes. However, the script was revised numerous times over the course of some 3 decades of revivals and publications, and the phrase is present in some versions of the script but not others. The exact phrase, as well as close variants, can be seen in newspaper and journal articles as early as 1909. There is some indication that it was cliched even then. The phrase, "elementary, my dear fellow, quite elementary," appears in P.G. Wodehouse's 1910 novel Smith in the City, and "elementary, my dear Watson, elementary" in his 1915 novel Smith, Journalist, neither spoken by Holmes. The exact phrase "elementary, my dear Watson" is used by protagonist Tom Beresford in Agatha Christie's 1922 novel The Secret Adversary. It also appears at the end of the 1929 film The Return of Sherlock Holmes, the first Holmes sound film. The phrase became familiar with the American public in part due to its use in the Rathbone-Bruce series of films from 1939 to 1946. Conan Doyle's 56 short stories and 4 novels are known as the canon by Holmes aficionados. Early canonical scholars included Ronald Knox in Britain and Christopher Morley in New York. Morley founded the Baker Street Irregulars, the first society devoted to the Holmes canon in 1934. The Sherlockian game, also known as the Holmesian game, the Great Game, or simply the Game, attempts to resolve anomalies and clarify details about Holmes and Watson from the canon. The game, which treats Holmes and Watson as real people, and Conan Doyle as Watson's literary agent, combines history with aspects of the stories to construct biographies and other scholarly analyses of these aspects. Ronald Knox is credited with inventing the game. One detail analysed in the game is Holmes's birth date. The chronology of the stories is notoriously difficult, with many stories lacking dates and many others containing contradictory ones. Morley and William Baring Gould, author of Sherlock Holmes of Baker Street, A Life of the World's First Consulting Detective, contend that the detective was born on the 6th of January 1854, the year being derived from the statement in his last bow that he was 60 years of age in 1914, while the precise day is derived from broader, non-canonical speculation. This is the date the Baker Street Irregulars work from, with their annual dinner being held each January. Laurie R. King also speculated about Holmes's birth date. She instead argues that details in The Adventure of the Gloria Scott indicate that Holmes finished his second and final year of university in 1880 or 1885. So if he began university at the age of 17, his birth date could be as late as 1868. Holmes's emotional and mental health have long been subjects of analysis in the game. At their first meeting, in A Study in Scarlet, the detective warns Watson that he gets in the dumps at times and doesn't open his mouth for days on end. Leslie S. Klinger has suggested that Holmes exhibits signs of bipolar disorder, with intense enthusiasm followed by indolent self-absorption. In 1934, the Sherlock Holmes Society in London and the Baker Street Irregulars in New York were founded. Both are still active, although the Sherlock Holmes Society was dissolved in 1937 and revived in 1951. The London Society is one of many worldwide who arrange visits to the scenes of Holmes's adventures, such as the Reichenbach Falls in the Swiss Alps. The two societies founded in 1934 were followed by many more, first in the US and then in England and Denmark. There are at least 250 societies worldwide, including Australia, Canada, India and Japan. Fans tend to be called Holmesians in Britain and Sherlockians in the United States. Though recently, Sherlockian has also come to refer to fans of the Benedict Cumberbatch BBC series, regardless of location. For the 1951 Festival of Britain, Holmes's living room was reconstructed as part of a Sherlock Holmes exhibition with a collection of original material. After the festival, items were transferred to the Sherlock Holmes, a London pub, and the Conan Doyle collection, housed in Lucens, Switzerland, by the author's son, Adrian. Both exhibitions, each with a Baker Street sitting room reconstruction, are open to the public. In 1990, the Sherlock Holmes Museum opened on Baker Street in London, followed the next year by a museum in Meiringen near the Reichenbach Falls dedicated to the detective. A private Conan Doyle collection is a permanent exhibition at the Portsmouth City Museum, where the author lived and worked as a physician. The London Metropolitan Railway named one of its 20 electric locomotives deployed in the 1920s for Sherlock Holmes. He was the only fictional character so honoured, along with eminent Britons such as Lord Byron, Benjamin Disraeli and Florence Nightingale. A number of London streets are associated with Holmes. York Mews South, off Crawford Street, was renamed Sherlock Mews, and Watson's Mews is near Crawford Place. In 2002, the Royal Society of Chemistry bestowed an honorary fellowship on Holmes for his use of forensic science and analytical chemistry in popular literature, making him, as of 2018, the only fictional character thus honoured. The popularity of Sherlock Holmes has meant that many writers other than Arthur Conan Doyle have created tales of the detective in a wide variety of different media, with varying degrees of fidelity to the original characters, stories and settings. According to the alternative Sherlock Holmes, Pastiches, Parodies and Copies by Peter Ridgway Watt and Joseph Green, the first known period pastiche dates from 1893. Entitled The Late Sherlock Holmes, it came from the pen of Conan Doyle's close friend J.M. Barrie. A common pastiche approach is to create a new story fully detailing an otherwise passing canonical reference, such as an aside by Conan Doyle mentioning the giant rat of Sumatra, a story for which the world is not yet prepared, in The Adventure of the Sussex Vampire. Other adaptations have seen the character taken in radically different directions, or placed in different times or even universes. For example, Holmes falls in love and marries in Laurie R. King's Mary Russell series, is reanimated after his death to fight future crime in the animated series Sherlock Holmes in the 20th Century, and is meshed with the setting of H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos in Neil Gaiman's A Study in Emerald, which won the 2004 Hugo Award for Best Short Story. An especially influential pastiche was Nicholas Meyer's The 7% Solution, a 1974 New York Times best-selling novel, in which Holmes's cocaine addiction has progressed to the point of endangering his career. It was made into a film of the same name in 1976, and popularized the pastiche writing trend of incorporating clearly identified and contemporaneous historical figures, such as Oscar Wilde, Aleister Crowley or Jack the Ripper, into tales featuring Holmes, something Conan Doyle himself never did. In addition to the Holmes canon, Conan Doyle's 1898 The Lost Special features an unnamed amateur reasoner intended to be identified as Holmes by his readers. The author's explanation of a baffling disappearance argued in Holmesian style poked fun at his own creation. Similar Conan Doyle short stories are the early The Field Bazaar, The Man with the Watches, and 1924's How Watson Learned the Trick, a parody of the Watson-Holmes breakfast table scenes. The author wrote other material, especially plays featuring Holmes. Much of it appears in Sherlock Holmes the Published Apocrypha, edited by Jack Tracy, The Final Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, edited by Peter Haining, and The Uncollected Sherlock Holmes, compiled by Richard Lancelyn Green. In terms of writers other than Conan Doyle, authors as diverse as Anthony Burgess, Neil Gaiman, Dorothy B. Hughes, Stephen King, Tanith Lee, A. Milne, and P.G. Wodehouse have all written Sherlock Holmes pastiches. Notably, famed American mystery writer John Dickson Carr collaborated with Arthur Conan Doyle's son, Adrian Conan Doyle, on The Exploits of Sherlock Holmes, a pastiche collection from 1954. In 2011, Anthony Horowitz published a Sherlock Holmes novel, The House of Silk, presented as a continuation of Conan Doyle's work and with the approval of the Conan Doyle estate. A sequel, Moriarty, followed in 2014. The popular MX Book of New Sherlock Holmes Stories series of pastiches, edited by David Markham and published in London by Steve MX's MX Publishing, features hundreds of stories echoing the original canon, which have been compiled for the benefit of the restoration of Undershaw, the former estate of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, which now houses Stepping Stones School. According to The Strand magazine, contributors include Mike Hogan, Kelvin Jones, Jim French, Arthur Hall, Steve Ehrman, Greg Hatcher, Jayantika Ganguly, Paul Freeman, Dick Gilman, Morris Barclay, Daniel D. Victor, Martin Rosenstock, Peter Koverbica, Hugh Ashton, Will Murray, Robert Perrett, Thaddeus Tuffant-Sama, G.L. Schultz, Tim Simons, and a poem by Derek Bellinger, as well as forewords in both volumes by Nicholas Meyer, Roger Johnson, and David Markham. Some authors have written tales centered on characters from the canon other than Holmes. M.J. Trow has written a series of 17 books using Inspector Lestrade as the central character, beginning with the adventures of Inspector Lestrade in 1985. Carol Nelson Douglas's Irene Adler series is based on The Woman from A Scandal in Bohemia, with the first book, 1990's Good Night, Mr. Holmes, retelling that story from Adler's point of view. Martin Davis has written 3 novels where Baker Street housekeeper Mrs. Hudson is the protagonist. Mycroft Holmes has been the subject of several efforts: 1979's Enter the Lion by Michael P. Hodel and Sean M. Wright, a 4-book series by Quinn Fawcett, and 2015's Mycroft by former NBA star Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. John Gardner, Michael Kurland, and Kim Newman, amongst many others, have all written tales in which Holmes's nemesis Professor Moriarty is the main character. Anthologies edited by Michael Kurland and George Mann are entirely devoted to stories told from the perspective of characters other than Holmes and Watson. Laurie R. King recreated Holmes in her Mary Russell series, beginning with 1994's The Beekeeper's Apprentice, set during the First World War and the 1920s. Her Holmes, semi-retired in Sussex, is stumbled upon by a teenaged American girl. Recognizing a kindred spirit, he trains her as his apprentice and subsequently marries her. As of 2018, the series includes 16 base novels and additional writings. The Final Solution, a 2004 novella by Michael Chabon, concerns an unnamed but long-retired detective interested in beekeeping who tackles the case of a missing parrot belonging to a Jewish refugee boy. Mitch Cullen's 2005 novel, A Slight Trick of the Mind, takes place 2 years after the end of the Second World War and explores an old and frail Sherlock Holmes, now 93, as he comes to terms with a life spent in emotionless logic. This was also adapted into a film, 2015's Mr. Holmes. There have been a host of scholarly works dealing with Sherlock Holmes, some working within the bounds of the Great Game, and some written with the understanding that Holmes is a fictional character. In particular, there have been 3 major annotated editions of the complete series. The first was William Baring Gould's 1967 The Annotated Sherlock Holmes. This 2-volume set was ordered to fit Baring Gould's preferred chronology and was written from a Great Game perspective. The second was 1993's The Oxford Sherlock Holmes, a 9-volume set written in a straight scholarly manner. The most recent is Leslie Klinger's 2005 work, The New Annotated Sherlock Holmes, a 3-volume set that returns to a Great Game perspective. Guinness World Records has listed Holmes as the most portrayed movie character, with more than 70 actors playing the part in over 200 films. His first screen appearance was in the 1900 Mutascope film Sherlock Holmes Baffled. The detective has appeared in many foreign language versions, including a Russian miniseries broadcast in November 2013. With 24 episodes per season, by the end of Season 2 of Elementary, Johnny Lee Miller became the actor who had portrayed Sherlock Holmes the most in television and/or film, beating Jeremy Brett with 41 television episodes, and Eileen Norwood with 47 silent films. William Gillette's 1899 play Sherlock Holmes, or The Strange Case of Miss Faulkner, was a synthesis of several Conan Doyle stories. In addition to its popularity, the play is significant because it, rather than the original stories, introduced one of the key visual qualities commonly associated with Holmes today: his calabash pipe. The play also formed the basis for the Gillette's 1916 film Sherlock Holmes. In his lifetime, Gillette performed as Holmes some 1,300 times. In the early 1900s, H.A. Saintsbury took over the role from Gillette for a tour of the play. Between this play and Conan Doyle's own stage adaptation of The Adventure of the Speckled Band, Saintsbury portrayed Holmes over 1,000 times. Basil Rathbone played Holmes and Nigel Bruce played Watson in 14 US films, 2 for 20th Century Fox and a dozen for Universal Pictures from 1939 to 1946, and in The New Adventures of Sherlock Holmes on the Mutual Radio Network from 1939 to 1946, before the role of Holmes passed to Tom Conway. While the Fox films were period pieces, the Universal films abandoned Victorian Britain and moved to a then contemporary setting in which Holmes occasionally battled Nazis. The 1984 to 1985 Italian-Japanese anime series Sherlock Hound adapted the Holmes stories for children, with its characters being anthropomorphic dogs. The series was co-directed by Hayao Miyazaki. Between 1979 and 1986, Soviet television produced a series of 5 television films, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. The series was split into 11 episodes and starred Vasily Livanov as Holmes and Vitaly Solomin as Watson. Livanov was appointed an honorary member of the Order of the British Empire for a performance Ambassador Anthony Brenton described as one of the best I've ever seen. Jeremy Brett played the detective in 7 series of Sherlock Holmes for Britain's Granada Television from 1984 to 1994. Watson was played by David Burke in the first 2 series and Edward Hardwicke in the remainder. Brett and Hardwicke also appeared on stage in 1988 to 1989 in The Secret of Sherlock Holmes, directed by Patrick Garland. Bert Coules penned The Further Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, starring Clive Merrison as Holmes and Michael Williams and Andrew Sachs as Watson, based on throwaway references in Conan Doyle's short stories and novels. He also produced original scripts for this series, which was also issued on CD. Coules had previously dramatised the entire Holmes canon for BBC Radio 4. The 2009 film Sherlock Holmes earned Robert Downey Jr. a Golden Globe Award for his portrayal of Holmes and co-starred Jude Law as Watson. Downey and Law returned for a 2011 sequel, Sherlock Holmes: A Game of Shadows. In March 2019, a release date of the 21st of December 2021 was set for the 3rd film in the series. Benedict Cumberbatch plays a modern version of the detective, with Martin Freeman as John Watson in the BBC One TV series Sherlock, which premiered in 2010. In the series, created by Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat, the story's original Victorian setting is replaced by present-day London. Cumberbatch's Holmes uses modern technology, including texting and blogging, to help solve crimes. Similarly, Elementary premiered on CBS in 2012. Set in contemporary New York, the series features Johnny Lee Miller as Sherlock Holmes and Lucy Liu as a female Dr. Joan Watson. The 2015 film Mr. Holmes starred Ian McKellen as a retired Sherlock Holmes living in Sussex in 1947, who grapples with an unsolved case involving a beautiful woman. The film is based on Mitch Cullen's 2005 novel A Slight Trick of the Mind. Holmes has also appeared in video games, including the Sherlock Holmes series of 8 main titles. According to the publisher Frogwares, the series has sold over 7 million copies. Sherlock Holmes will forever be a part of the pop culture lexicon, and with good reason. He's as layered a character as they come that's both smart, funny, tough, and fascinating. Whether it be now or hundreds of years from now, as long as Sherlock Holmes is involved, the game will always be afoot.